welcome to My Favorite Mystic, a podcast about the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. I'm AJ Langley, and today I'm joined by Jessica Barr. She's an associate professor of comparative literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and co-editor of the Journal of Medieval Religious Cultures. Her current research involves representations of death and dying in medieval women's devotional literature and hagiography. Jessica, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So today you're here to speak about Gertrude of Helfta, but before we get into her, let's start with a little bit about you. How did you get interested in mysticism as a field of study?
Well, I have two answers to that question. One is more academic and one more personal, even dare I say mystical, although I use that word in a very tongue-in-cheek sort of way. So the academic answer to that question is I somehow got to my second year of graduate school without ever studying the Middle Ages at all, except for a history of the English language course as an undergraduate. And I was in a graduate seminar with Professor Elizabeth Bryan, who ended up becoming my advisor.
Ooh, what was the course?
The course was just Introduction to Medieval Studies. It was a great course, covered a lot of things. And at the very end of the semester, we were reading Julian of Norwich and the Book of Margery Kempe. I'd, of course, never heard of these before, having been somehow excluded from medieval studies up to that point, but I was just fascinated by them. I kind of fell in love.
I mean, who wouldn't? But what were you working on before you found medieval holy women?
Before that, I had been considering writing a dissertation on 19th century literature, maybe something to do with women. It was all very vague. But when I read Margery and Julian, I just felt that this was something I could say something about. And so I began a rather extensive sort of remediation course in medieval literature and mysticism in general. And that's been what I've been working on for the last 20 years. The less academic answer, actually, a few years previously, I had a dream in which I was walking around. It was a kind of boring dream, actually. I was walking around and around an enormous brick cathedral. I don't know why it was brick, but I was noticing how heavy it was and yet how tall it was. And I thought out of nowhere, this is sort of like a medieval mystic who is this embodied person living in the world, but also has these aspirations up into heaven and into the divine. And that was the end of the dream. And I didn't think about it again for a while, I think until I was getting interested in Julian and Margery. And then I thought, wait, that was really sort of prescient. Because then what I ended up really being interested in was precisely that sort of negotiation between the material and the supernal, the otherworldly, that you see in so much of that literature.
So it turns out that you had your own sort of prophetic dream.
I did. And it was before I'd even started graduate school, I believe. So I think it was, either right around the beginning of my studies or shortly before, but certainly before I had ever thought one way or the other about medieval mysticism. So so that's why I think it is a mystical type of dream in its own way, although again, a little tongue in cheek on that one.
But still incredibly fascinating.
Thank you.
Okay, so you started with Julian and Margery. How did you find Gertrude of Helfta?
Honestly, I tried to remember that myself, how I wound up focusing on the particular mystics I did in my dissertation. I suspect a lot of it was I spent a lot of time in the library stacks in like the BX and BV section, which is where all of the mystics are. And I would just pull things off the shelves that looked interesting and read bits of them. And the ones that I preferred are the ones I kind of stayed with. And Gertrude I encountered very early. There's a chapter about her in my dissertation, a chapter about her in my first and second books, and it looks like she's going to creep into my current projects as well. But there's something so appealing, I find, about her voice, especially in the first person portion of her writings. There's this lovely liveliness. You really get a sense of her personality and this kind of movement back and forth between this very intimate mode and where she's describing things in just a really personal and kind of warm way. And then also, then moving into her visions of Christ and, kind of larger revelations and messages as well. But there's that intimacy to her writing that I find really attractive. And I think that's one of the things that keeps me returning to her text. Also, she's just really intellectually interesting and there's just a lot going on in her work.
That does make a big difference to being able to stick with a mystic, certainly. Now, like with Julian and Margery, where they are so often paired together and compared and contrasted, with Gertrude of Helfta, we actually have other mystics who were her contemporaries in the same convent, and they all kind of get grouped together as the mystics of Helfta.
Yeah, they're wonderful. It's just one of the things that I find so interesting about them is that community, right? Not just their writings, but the fact of that community at Helfta, where we have Gertrude, who came to the convent of St. Mary at Helfta when she was 4 or 5 years old. So she lived pretty much her whole life there. But then also Mechtilde of Hackeborn, who is the originator, I guess you could say, of the Book of Special Grace. And then Mechtilde Magdeburg the Beguine, who came later in life And then the abbess Gertrude of Helfta. Lots of Gertrudes and Mechtildes, as I'm sure you're encountering.
Absolutely. It can get confusing because every Gertrude seems to have a Mechtilde. It's like those are the names for sisters in this period. I mean, they're the Anna and Elsa naming convention of their time.
That's a really good way to put it. And Gertrude of Helfta, who is the sister of Mechtilde of Helfta, her interest in educating her nuns, her insistence that they learn to read and write in Latin, and just the extensive library that they had, and all the collaborative authorship that was going on there. So Gertrude is considered the author of the Herald of God's Loving Kindness, a 5-volume work, but really only one part of that, book 2, was written in the first person, and the rest was collaboratively produced with other nuns. She may have had a hand in writing Mechtilde of Helfta's Book of Special Grace. There's probably some overlapping authorship between those two works. So just the idea of this whole community of nuns that was so invested in literate activity and in writing for each other and preserving the revelations and the theological reflections of the women there. It's just a really interesting phenomenon.
I completely agree. And I feel like when we find these communities that encourage these women to really engage with these texts on a serious, deep level, that is interesting in itself. I mean, the mystics are almost secondary at that point.
I know it is. But that's the way we know about them, right? Like, I do wonder about those other nuns. There's the Schwester N that Gertrude posits as one of the authors of the Herald. Who were these women, right? And what were their experiences of this community? It just seems like such a rich network. We don't have a full picture of it, but we have a lot, right? We do have a lot. And Gertrude also, she has visions of other nuns at the convent after they die. She has visions of lay brothers who worked at the convent after their deaths too. So just that kind of general communal orientation that we see in Mechtilde of Helfta and Gertrude as well is really fascinating.
And I think it's a really interesting point of comparison between the Helfta mystics that Mechtilde of Magdeburg, she spent so much of her life outside of the convent, and she didn't seem to like the other beguines that she lived with, but after some time at Helfta, the sections of her work that are seemingly recorded while she's there, she seems a lot more interested in the idea of community, whereas Mechtilde of Helfta and Gertrude obviously spent the majority of their lives there and therefore are much more seemingly invested in the sisters, the community, this collaborative endeavor.
Yeah, there's such a strong communal orientation at Helfta. And you get the impression from Mechtilde of Magdeburg that she struggled a lot, just in general. I mean, one of the striking things in Gertrude of Helfta's writing, and maybe it's because she was at the convent from such a young age, she never puts herself down for being a woman. She's never worried about that. She uses feminine in her spiritual exercises, which it's attributed to her anyway. She uses feminine adjectives to describe the speaker of the prayers, not all the time, but pretty consistently, but not as a sense of like, as a woman, I am less than, right? There's just a sort of acceptance of femaleness. And Mechtilde of Magdeburg, she says, I was told that this book would be burned, and just much greater anxiety just to negotiate with the world in a way that Gertrude of Helfta does not appear to have had to have done.
No, she doesn't. And it's actually really refreshing that she doesn't seem to feel like she needs to justify herself or that anyone is going to doubt her authority at any point, which is just really unusual in this kind of text in this period.
Yeah, it really is. It's a given. And, if they're writing for their community, they trust each other. They believe each other. They're writing for each other. There's something very affirmative about that.
Love it. Smashing the patriarchy without even realizing you're doing it.
Exactly.
Okay, we need to backtrack massively because we have spun out of control. So let's go back to where the podcast normally starts with who was Gertrude of Helfta? What do we know about her? What do we know about her life? Can you tell us a bit about her?
Sure. Yeah. So we don't know a whole lot of details about her life. We know she lived from 1256 to 1302, and she came to the convent when she was very young, probably 4 or 5 years old. The rest we can glean from the biographical portions of the Herald of God's Loving Kindness. As I said, that's the 5-volume work, whose authorship is attributed to Gertrude, although it was mostly written in collaboration with other nuns at the convent. So by author, it doesn't mean she put pen to paper and wrote the whole thing down herself, but she had considerable input. And then there's the second volume of that book is the autobiographical portion that she wrote herself. But from the biographical bits in the Herald, it seems that she was one of the things I find appealing about her too is that she was a very good student and she loved secular literature. She enjoyed reading, but by her own account, she wasn't particularly interested in religion per se until she was about 25 years old, when she had this big vision of Jesus as a very attractive young man. And that kind of swayed her over. She realized just that she had been wearing the habit of a nun, but not really participating meaningfully in its life. And he consoles her. And then from there on, she's committed. So she was very interested in books in general throughout her life. A lot of her activity at the convent was centered around writing, teaching, advising, copying texts, finding texts for people, copying out passages that they would find useful and that kind of thing. So just a lot of textual and literate activity that she engaged in. She had a number of visions of Jesus, often very intimate, kind of comforting visions. She's considered one of the founders of the devotion to the Sacred Heart. And in fact, the Helfta community as a whole was a really strong piece in sort of creating that movement of this focus on Jesus's heart and finding solace there. And she's also, as I mentioned briefly, she's considered the author of the spiritual exercises, a set of 7 devotional exercises, several of which are really focused on different stages of profession in the nun's life. It's not absolutely certain that she wrote the spiritual exercises, but that's the general consensus at this point.
So what order was she part of?
So she was a nun at the convent of St. Maria at Helfta in northern Germany, which was a Benedictine convent, although it has really strong Cistercian affinities, and there's kind of an ongoing discussion about whether it should be classified as Cistercian or Benedictine, which I'm not particularly going to get into here. But there are a lot of resonances in her writing and in the writings of Mechtilde Pachelborn with the writings of Bernard of Clairvaux and the kind of Cistercian bridal mysticism that was a sort of dominant strain in the 13th century.
And speaking of these writings, you mentioned that it seems like we have a lot of writings, but they're not necessarily by her.
Exactly. So one of the exciting things about the convent at Helfta was this atmosphere of collaborative authorship that we see in both Gertrude's writings and in the writing of Mechtilde Pachelborn, another nun who's living at the convent at the same time. So Gertrude's Herald of God's Loving Kindness, as I mentioned, it's a 5-volume work. It's really substantial. The first book was written by at least one other nun. It's in the third person. It's a sort of hagiography of Gertrude, although it ends before her death. And in fact, the entire 5-volume work ends before her death. So there's no account of her death, although there's a lot of anticipation of it, as there often is in these things, right? Book 2, which is another kind of slender part of this massive work, is Gertrude's spiritual autobiography, where she describes her first visions of Jesus and how those came about. And then it's a narrative, many of these consolations she received from him, the process of writing the text, which is really interesting, where she struggles with being able to write it and her resistance to writing it. And then books 3, 4, and 5 are third-person accounts of her various visions and spiritual practices. And there's a great deal of attention, which is something I've become interested in lately, to the idea of death and Gertrude's own preparation for death. Many visions of dead people, ranging from the Virgin Mary to like little sister A who died last week, right? So this kind of like span from saints to people that she would have known very well. Also some passages in which Gertrude herself seems to be kind of trying to orchestrate her own death. Like, I would really like it if I could die in this chapel immediately after saying this particular prayer, and maybe someone could sing this hymn and Mary will come, right? So these kind of trying to engineer the conditions of her own death. But they also contain accounts of various miracles that have to do with Gertrude. There are a few, not a whole lot of miracles, a few like weather miracles and some predictions and things. But mostly it has to do with consoling visions, constellations of other nuns, things that she learns about other nuns to be able to help them, devotional and spiritual practices that she engages in and that are recommended for others. So just a really expansive kind of account of her devotional and theological practices and teachings. But to return to your original question, yes, it was authored collaboratively. Those last 3 books, as well as the first, were written by other nuns, obviously with a lot of input from Gertrude. But we don't know how many other nuns, just that there was this kind of communal practice of writing that was really prominent at the monastery at Helfta.
So I want to talk a little bit about her relationship with the divine, because one of the things I find really interesting about mystics who are in convents from a very young age is we don't often get a conversion experience because they've always been there, it's always been part of their lives. But Gertrude does have this kind of moment where she meets Christ and then thinks, I need to do better. So what does her relationship with God look like, and how does it develop over the course of the work?
Well, we really see it. It's right in the beginning of book 2, her autobiographical account. So she doesn't really tell us what was going on before, except I can read briefly what she says. You were attempting to pull down the tower of vanity and worldliness into which my pride had grown, even though I bore an empty boast, the name and habit of the religious life. So she has this sort of realization when she's 25, and she has this first vision of Jesus that she's not really been living up to her role as a nun, which, you wonder, like, maybe she didn't even realize she wasn't living up to it, right? Until that moment. But you're right that she doesn't have a conversion into the religious life. It's rather a conversion into a truer or deeper or more meaningful life. And from then on, she has this ongoing relationship with Jesus where she'll have these moments of doubt and he will console her or comfort her, or she'll have questions and she'll say, why is this particular sister struggling so much? And he'll sort of help her understand how to comfort that person. So it's a very intimate relationship, though. There's a great deal of her sort of melting into Jesus, having his wounds inscribed on her, constantly striving to sort of better and more fully understand and inhabit his suffering and the meaning of that suffering for salvation. So, I think a lot of her bodily imagery too, such as the yearning for inscription on her heart and on her spiritual body, the yearning to experience his wounds is a yearning for knowledge of, like, fully understanding what Jesus' suffering means for her own salvation and the salvation of everyone.
And speaking of everyone and this idea of learning more about her sisters in the community in order to support them, the fact that this is a religious community, the fact that there are these other holy women there who are also singled out as having these miraculous visionary experiences and profound relationships with the divine, it does seem to set them up for competition in some ways. And this actually, I remember, comes through for a moment in Gertrude's work, where someone comes to the convent asking to be led to the person that would be the most beneficial for their own spiritual journey, and seems to expect that they would be led to one of the Mechtildes, but instead they kept getting led to Gertrude. And I just remember thinking, I thought this was a supportive community. Why are they in competition?
I guess that's a kind of support. I don't that is a funny passage, right? And Mechtild has a number of visions of Gertrude too, which are written about in Gertrude's book too. I was just looking at one this morning where Mechtild sees Gertrude's heart as a bridge between Christ's humanity and his divinity. And any soul who traverses this bridge will be led directly to the Lord. I'm not quite sure what that means in practice. I think it means that you listen to her teachings and you take her advice. But that's a vision that Mechtild has about Gertrude. And I believe Gertrude has some visions back about Mechtild too. But there is this kind of mutually reinforcing visionary network they're having. But you're right, in that one passage, it seems it's a little competitive almost, right? And one wonders about the nun who wrote that and what she might have had in mind.
I like the idea that there might have been some sort of competition between Gertrude's supporters and Mechtild's supporters happening in Helfta during the time. It's fairly intriguing.
What a friendly competition. Well, Team Mechtild and Team Mechtild, so.
True. Team Mechtild, or Team Gertrude. There's just too many holy women in Helfta for it not to be a competition. So, going back to Gertrude and her writing, what kind of writing style does she use? What kind of experiences does she convey? Tell us a little bit about the work itself.
Well, it's prose. It's very liturgically oriented. It's not necessarily what, someone who's out there looking for their first medieval mystic, you're probably not going to find her to be the most gripping because there is so much liturgical language. But she was living in a convent, right, for nearly her entire life. So this is the language that really informs her thinking and informs her devotion. So she has a number of revelations that are either sparked by liturgy, or there are some times where she has a question and then it's sort of answered by the words from the Mass that day. In addition to the liturgical language, she uses a lot of really effusive language and imagery, particularly in describing her relationship with Jesus and the sweetness of Jesus. So lots of dulcissima and, just kind of layering on the superlatives. I have a quote from William James, which always really makes me angry. So just to give a sense of someone who didn't appreciate her effusive language, James writes that this is a lower example of theophatic saintliness, that her revelations consist mainly of proofs of Christ's partiality for her undeserving person, assurances of his love, intimacies, and caresses and compliments of the most absurd and puerile sort, addressed by Christ to Gertrude as an individual, form the tissue of this paltry-minded recital. So needless to say, the contemporary scholarly consensus around Gertrude has changed considerably since James wrote that in the very early 20th century, where he sees her effusive language as evidence of some kind of weakness of intellect and imagination on her part. I think it's really much more steeped in, Cistercian bridal mysticism. It's an attempt to kind of present the glory of Christ as Gertrude understood it, through language. And language is always going to fall short, right? So she's trying through her use of superlatives and the kind of accumulation of adjectives to just show that greatness. And then also the personal nature of her revelations, which James criticizes. There's a constant kind of movement in her writing between those personal assurances and this kind of broader meaning for the community and broader theological understanding that's being conveyed. So sort of like the intimacy and the personalness, it becomes an illustration of this kind of broader truth that she's attempting to convey. To return to your question more specifically about the kinds of language, so I mentioned there's language of inscription. There's a lot of bodily imagery, a lot of hearts, a lot of entering into the heart of Jesus, a lot of wounding, right? Wound of love is another frequent image, bridal imagery as well, which, again, shows that kind of Cistercian influence of bridal mysticism. So I wouldn't say there's like a distinctive type of unusual image that she uses, but I would characterize her prose as really being very liturgically oriented and also just conveying this kind of overwhelming sense of love and tenderness and sweetness, really, in the kind of less saccharine sense of that word, that she receives from her experiences with God.
I mean, all of that sounds so fascinating, but the fact that you started off with that quote from William James from his Varieties of Religious Experience and the audacity of that quote, like sometimes you just want to go back in time and fight a scholar, and I feel like that's where I am. Like the affective side of these things is so important and interesting. Not that that's the only thing that's there, obviously. There's so much more to be said about these works, but it's just so dismissive and irritating. Luckily, we have moved on from that.
Well, one of the things that I find really exciting in Helfta studies right now, and in the study of medieval mysticism right now in general, not just Helfta, is, we've spent a lot of time looking at the affective side of these writings, which is, of course, really important. And, there's been a move towards, kind of contra James, towards seeing that affectivity as valuable and rich and interesting rather than as something kind of weak and womanly. But there's also this tremendous attention, especially in the last few years, at least in terms of the Helfta mystics, with really viewing them as theologians and their writing as a type of theological writing rather than just sort of like naive autobiographical accounts, right? So Ella Johnson had a book come out last year that really takes seriously Gertrude's writings as theology and, what is her theology of the Eucharist, right, that she's presenting through her volumes. And there are other books. Rasha Kirakosian has one coming out, and I think Anna Harrison has one coming out next year too, that are looking at different aspects of the Helfta mystics. But part of that is taking their status as serious thinkers seriously, rather than just seeing them as a bunch of women who kind of had hysterical visions on the fainting couch or whatever, right?
Exactly, and it is so important to make that move and to make that shift. When you read these works, and I mean, it's probably especially apt for communities like Helfta that were so focused on study and learning and writing and really engaging with education as like a key feature of that community. But these mystical works engage with important ideas about faith and its practice and belief that we just need to be able to get into without it being dismissed as, oh, they just really, really loved God.
Or they didn't really understand what Bernard was saying or something like that, rather than they're making their own contribution, right? Where they differ from scholastic theologians might not be a shortcoming. It might be a contribution, right?
Exactly.
And I think and it's just sort of funny, we're so far away from the 13th century, and yet it seems like because they're not writing in the mode of academic theologians of the 13th century, somehow what they're saying doesn't really count, right? But of course, they're not writing in that mode. They were excluded from the universities. So why would they write in that mode? Instead, they are writing something that I would like to argue is in some ways much richer because it can incorporate all these different genres and different modalities, right? And incorporate autobiographical experience and incorporate shared experience, but, use it pedagogically, use it didactically to explicate and further, very complex ideas.
Absolutely. And in some cases, though not all, they're also a lot more readable than some of the scholastics.
Right. That's true. Yeah, it's sort of nice to get those personal accounts once in a while. They kind of, at least for a 21st century reader, I think they definitely anchor you a little more than the like question and answers of Aquinas or someone.
I think that they provide a really interesting look at what it really meant to be devoutly religious in this moment. And it wasn't necessarily sitting in a classroom defining the Trinity, but it's engaging daily with the faith.
Right, right. And what does that mean for your own lived reality? Mm-hmm.
Exactly. These works are so good. Anyway, away from mysticism, mystical studies in general, and back to Gertrude, is there one moment from the text that you always think of immediately when you think of her, or one particular vision or passage that you just love and really enjoy engaging with?
One of the passages that I've engaged with more than once, and I keep finding interesting, and it overlaps with related passages in so many mystical texts, but I always find this thing really intriguing, is the difficulty of writing. I'm very interested in writing and textuality, and I kind of can't get away from that.
The difficulty of writing is something that is just so resonant as an academic.
Exactly. If only I could blame my inability to write a conference paper on the fact that it's about the ineffable, right? And it's just beyond words. My argument's beyond words. But she has a really interesting, I think it's an interesting passage about her challenges with writing in book 2 of the Herald, where she writes about how she considered it so inappropriate to write down this account. And she's kind of stalling. And it's interesting because it's one of these parts where the Lord just keeps saying, no, seriously, you need to do what I'm telling you to do, right? Like, you can't fake your way around it. He tells her, you may know for certain that you will never leave the prison of the flesh until you pay out that final penny, which until now you've held back. She goes on, I was meditating on the fact that I had written down everything that he'd mentioned, or even if I'd not actually written it, I had nonetheless made restitution by my words with my neighbor's profit in mind. So she's like, okay, I didn't really write it, but I talked about it. But the Lord put in my way the verse which I had heard read at loud that very night. If the Lord had given nothing but oral teachings to those who were present, there would only have been sayings, not writings. But now they have in addition been written down for the salvation of many. The Lord added, do not cross me. It's my wish to have in your writings irrefutable evidence of my divine loving kindness. So he's not having it. And then she struggles to write how difficult and impossible of me to find expression or words with which his many sayings could be brought forth without shocking human understanding. The Lord, aware of my faint heart, seemed to drench my soul with the most generous shower of rain. Its heavy fall beat down on me, miserable scrap of humanity that I am, a delicate and tender little shoot, and flattened me to the ground. I could absorb nothing of any use except some profoundly significant words, which I could not grasp with my human understanding. Completely overwhelmed by this, I asked what could come of these words. And then once she's complained to him that this is too much, she moderates it. So she just gets a little bit at a time and she's able to write everything that way. But there's so many things in that passage that I found really interesting. There's the kind of dialogue with God that she's having where she's not really happy with what he's saying and he's not really happy with what she's saying. And you just kind of, and then he gives her too much at once and she's beaten down by all the words that she can't possibly understand or grasp or really put into writing. And so he has to back off. And it's just so textured. I don't know. It's such a complex relationship that they seem to have there, which in some ways is very human, oddly enough, right? When you're talking about the Lord. But the fact that he goes too far and then has to scale it back, the way that she figures her body as this weak little scrap of humanity, this tender little shoot that just can't possibly bear what he's making her do, that negotiation that they have to have about the writing of her text, which I find really fascinating.
I love the very beginning where it's like, I mean, I've written some of it down and I haven't written it down. I've thought about it and told people. So that's basically the same thing.
Right. Exactly. She's making excuses, right? She's making excuses to God about why she hasn't done it. She's kind of done it. Come on. In spirit. She did it in spirit, right? But no, it's not enough. And then, there's also the fact that he's comparing her writings to scripture, which is kind of just sort of buried in there. But, it's important that we have this in writing as incontrovertible proof of my loving kindness, right? That there's also tied into this passage of sort of extreme humility on Gertrude's part, this the incredible importance of her text at the same time that's being validated by God. But again, as you said, we don't see a lot of her vying for authority here either. It's just kind of taken for granted almost that, of course, these words are authoritative and these words are important and they need to be preserved.
And lucky for us, they were preserved, and so we've gotten to hear all about her. Now, we are coming to the end of the podcast, which means I have to ask you the one big question, which is, with all the mystics that you've studied and all the work that you've done, why is Gertrude of Helfta your favorite mystic?
Oh, I don't know. She just is.
Okay, good. That's it. It's Ineffable podcast over. Thanks for being here.
I'll give you a better answer than that. I thought about Christina Mirabilis, Christina the Astonishing. She's sort of the flashiest mystic, and she'd be a lot of fun to talk about. But honestly, if I'm honest with myself, it's Gertrude. I think there's something I find very homey about Gertrude, that she doesn't have the wild extravagances of Christina or even I love Marjorie Kemp too. I love so many of them, right? But that Gertrude seems sort of like a real person in some ways. And there's so many moments in her text that, especially in book 2, move back and forth between this very kind of colloquial, intimate accounts of her own behavior and her own thoughts and wishes, and then these very lofty visions. And it's almost kind of funny. I was looking at another passage today where she's given some very good spiritual advice and she doesn't like it. She's like, that doesn't apply to me. I mean, how often have we thought that, right? So there are these, I don't want to use the word relatable because that's a word that has come to get under my skin, but she kind of is, right? Relatable in some ways. She's someone I feel like I could know as a person in a way. And then another reason that I think I just enjoy her so much is her love of books and writing and texts and just the pervasiveness of textual language in her writing and the writings about her. There's something so appealingly bookish about Gertrude and about the Helfta mystics in general. That, is another reason I think I keep coming back to her.
I mean, nothing says academia like really loving bookish, nerdy mystics. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today and for telling me all about Gertrude of Helfta.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
It really was. Thank you again. And thank you all for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic, and join me next time when I speak to John Arblaster about Jan van Roosbroek.